You know, when I first saw Arlecchino in Winter Night's Lazo, my first thought was, oh, she's pretty cool. Cool. Yeah, nothing ever back then could have prepared me for this. So, as you can probably see, Arlecchino ended up being a teeny tiny bit more than just cool. Her overall design and aesthetics turned out way better than I could have ever imagined when I first saw her back in the day, which is a pleasant surprise to say the least. Hoyoverse did a very good job with her design, so much so that because of her I am now re-evaluating everything I know about Capitano, Colombina, and Piero, especially El Capitano. But this video isn't about Colombina, Capitano, or Piero. It's about the Knave, Arlecchino. So let us start with who Arlecchino is, and trust me, as you're gonna see throughout this video, there is a lot more to her than what meets the eye. Arlecchino, whose real name is Peruere, was a cursed orphan girl who was found and raised by the Fatui's intelligence collecting department, specifically in a special orphanage they operated known as the House of the Hearth in Fontaine. Over time, a conflict of interest led Peruere to kill the previous knave Crucibina, a feat that certainly no one should overlook, especially for a kid her age. Eventually, she was pardoned by the Tsaritsa and granted the title of a Harbinger herself, which led her to take over the responsibilities of mother. After that, whoa. Hold on, stop right there, let's rewind a bit. You know how I said earlier that Peruere was raised in Fontaine? Yeah, I picked my words carefully because unlike what the game might lead you to believe, little Peruere over here is not a Fontanian. And although simply not being native to Fontaine is generally enough to point out, since the Fontanians are Oceanids transformed by Egeria, making them inherently different from the rest of Teyvat, the distinction here in particular is more prominent than you might think. You see, Peruere is not a Mondstadian, not a Sumerian, she is Khaenri'ahn. Perhaps not by land, probably not by land, but undeniably by birth. After fighting the Knave in her story quest when the Hearth Flame goes out, you will be able to go to the archive and access the backstory behind her power. There it is explicitly written that Peruere is a direct descendant of the Crimson Moon dynasty, the royal bloodline that ruled Khaenri'ah before the rise of the Eclipse, who took over them. In that same quest, Arlecchino goes out of her way to confirm that she does not belong to Fontaine, and only says otherwise for the sake of diplomatic maneuvering. This is all further backed up by the fact that unlike native Fontanians, Peruere cannot jump out of the water, which is an immediate indicator that she belongs to the Crimson Moon dynasty of Khaenri'ah. Alright, now that we have gone over who she is, it is time for the main purpose of this series, which is analyzing the design of a character by examining all of the sources of inspiration that we can find behind said character. And when it comes to Peruere, oh boy, she has a lot, and I mean a lot, even by the standards of Hoyoverse. So, let's get into it. As a harbinger of the Fatui, Peruere takes on the name and role of one of the stock characters of the Commedia dell'arte, a type of Italian theater which uses masks to designate a character's role in the story. And Peruere's role in this story happens to be that of Arlecchino. The Arlecchino of the Commedia dell'arte is also known as Harlequin, is a character famous for his acrobatic and physical agility, often portrayed as a cunning servant or trickster who maneuvers himself into and out of trouble with equal parts wit and athleticism. This character, with his vividly colorful patchwork costume, traditionally symbolizes the light-hearted and subversive elements of the play, reflecting the duality of human nature, both clever and foolish. In their adaptation, Hoyoverse incorporated this element of duality almost perfectly into Peruere. After all, she is referred to as a woman who bears the fire of two worlds, much like the orphaned Outlanders who were taken in by her ancestors as described in the book Perenhere. Furthermore, Peruere is incredibly fast in her fighting style, boasts swift and fluid movements with deceptive strength behind her attacks. And in her boss fight, Arlecchino spends much time dashing and jumping around silk threads, reflecting the agility and acrobatic prowess that her Commedia dell'arte counterpart is so well known for. Her general outfit is a combination of various artworks of Arlecchino made by the Spanish artist Pablo Picasso. Now, Picasso was self-admittedly fascinated by the character of Arlecchino. which drove him to make many variations of it throughout his life. And for obvious reasons, we do not have time to go through all of them. This video is primarily about Dark Souls and Sekiro, not Picasso. From Picasso's work, the following three stand out to me the most. This one, Harlequin of the Black Mask, is almost certainly the piece that inspired Peruere's Fatui mask in Genshin, which you can see in this scene right here, where she does look a lot like a character called Raven from Honkai Impact 3rd. This one has the flared accents that you see at the end of her sleeves and pants, and finally, you have this one, which invokes the duality of Arlecchino that I mentioned earlier, this duality that, as you will soon see, is fundamental to Peruere's character. The first and most eye-catching part of Perry's design is her eyes, which are certainly directly based on pretzel bread. Yes, I don't care if this is what the developers intended or not, now suffer with me every time you look at her. But to be more specific, what makes her eyes stand out are their X-mark-shaped pupils, and this cross-mark shape is not just on her eyes, it's all over her. It's on her chest ornament, her clothes, her back, her scythe, her boss fight animations, the icons of her elemental skill and elemental burst, and on the animations of her elemental skill and elemental burst. Even when she throws her scythe to the ground, it leaves an X mark. I mean, for God's sake, she's got so many X marks all over her that I wouldn't be surprised if you told me that her lead character designer is freaking Elon Musk.
X.
On a more serious note, aside from any story-specific relevance to the crossmark that we might still not know about, all I can tell you regarding it is that it is supposed to symbolize death. After all, the children in Perry and Harry had to undergo some sort of death, and Perry is a character surrounded by death ever since her childhood. Alternatively, for some more creative interpretations, the crossmark could symbolize the unknown. For example, when solving a mathematical equation compromising a solitary indeterminate, it is customary to designate this variable with the symbol X. A cross could also symbolize, well, the crossing of two different paths, the merging of two fires, once again just as described in Perry and Harry. And if we choose to take a literal approach, pun intended, crossing something out marks it as wrong, as incorrect, something that is the opposite of what should be. This one will explain itself once we get to her transformation, and to get to that, we're gonna have to talk about her color palette. Peruere's attire is dominated by three colors, those being white, red, and black. Her tailored coat, which takes up most of the space on her body, is predominantly white and splits into what resembles two wings or a bird's tail feathers. The reason this is so interesting is because white is generally considered the color of purity, and Peruere's design incorporates numerous angelic motifs. The hair tie at the back of her head consists of a white angelic wing paired with a black feather. She also has several crimson eyes on her outfit, reminiscent of the biblical angels who are described with many eyes scattered across their bodies, especially on their wings. Actually, on that topic, Peruere has 9 eyes. She has 2 functional eyes on her face, along with 6 of these crimson eye embellishments on her front. Then, you have the vision on her back, which is considered a symbolic type of eye. And this is where the real genius of her design comes into play. When unleashing her power, Peruere replaces her 2 angel wings with 6 spider appendages, which she can further morph into these 6 giant crimson angelic wings, each with an eye of its own. This definitively makes Perry a seraphim, as those are also described in the Old Testament to have 6 red wings. And what I find so cool about these wings is that the 6 eyes on them are actually the same 6 crimson eye embellishments she has in her normal form. I wasn't sure of whether that was really the case at first, so I took some time to compare the 2 models, and then I noticed this red spine running down her back. It also swaps positions when she transforms and ends up on the front across her chest and abdomen. So it's almost as if Peruere, when unleashing her power, is inverting herself, a masterful depiction of the duality that the Commedia dell'arte Is Arlecchino embodies, which in Genshin became the cinder of 2 worlds' flames. Another interesting detail is the fact that she ends up with 10 eyes instead of 9. Her vision becomes a delusion, which is called an evil eye in Chinese, and she gains an additional crimson eye embellishment on her head. This is significant, as number 10 symbolizes total completeness in the Bible and absolute perfection in Chinese culture. However, the fact that this is her perfected form also carries with it a hint of irony, because to achieve it, Peruere somewhat abandons a part of herself by embracing the gaze of the crimson moon. And in the process, she burns away her angelic wings and replaces them with spider legs. This transcendence, so to speak, is also symbolized through the change in her color palette, where most of the white in her is replaced with darker shades of red and black. Here, her appearance becomes more in line with this version of Harlequin by the French painter Paul Cézanne. Earlier, I talked about how white symbolizes purity and is a color commonly associated with angels. And when Peruere transforms, she does not only lose all that which is white in her clothes. In that form, even the angel wing hair tie she wears on the back of her head is gone. And this is the irony I've been talking about. Her transcendence is also a fall from grace, like an angel that burns away all that which makes it pure, leaving nothing but ash and cinders. A choice only made by a fool. Knowing this, I am sure that you can see why the developers at Hoyoverse chose to flip her front and back during her transformation. It is a brilliant trick to convey the idea of both her fall and transcendence at the same time, that she becomes the opposite of an angel, a fallen angel, a demon. On that note, the name of the Commedia dell'arte is Arlecchino, well, both of his names actually, Arlecchino and Harlequin, are derived from two different demons. When it comes to Arlecchino, the name originates from that of a devil featured in Dante Alighieri's Inferno, known as Arlecchino. This devil is tasked with punishing corrupt politicians and is part of a group known as the Malebranche, which means the evil claws, who are renowned for their cruelty and enjoyment in tormenting the sinners. How this ties into Peruere is self-evident. She is called the Knave, her constellation is a claw, and her hands, I don't think I need to explain this one. Furthermore, part of Peruere's job is to carry out assassinations against extremely high-profile figures, and most of the time, such people end up being wealthy businessmen, political leaders, and fake philanthropists, just like Magan Tartuffe, whom she kills in her character teaser. On the other hand, Arlecchino's other name, Harlequin, is an evolution of Heliquin, which is the name of another devil that appears in old French fashion plays about the crucifixion of Christ. And Heliquin is in turn an evolution of an English mythological figure known as King Hurla of the Wild Hunt. My very next video is going to be about King Hurla of the Wild Hunt. However, to avoid overinflating this video, all you need to know for now is that Hurla was a great Welsh king who was cursed eternally to lead a spectral procession hunting and gathering the souls of the dead and those who are about to die. Now, there is a lot more to Hurla's story with Peruere. Just wait for the upcoming video and you will see. But even from the little I told you, we can still make a clear design connection. Just like Hurla, Peruere is also technically a king. After all, that was her purpose when she was under the care of the previous knave Crusabina, to kill all the other children and emerge as the one true king. Additionally, just like Hurla, Peruere was also cursed, and both their curses are heavily involved with death. From Arlecchino's first story quest and fourth character story, we learn that her curse causes those who die by her flames to leave behind after images, a sort of soul fragment or shadow. Kinda like the shades of Tokoyo from Enkanomiya. You can see these after images gathering around Peruere right before her boss fight, taking the appearance of either these faceless fairies or these single-eyed ones right here. You can take a closer look at them since they linger around the boss fight arena after the fight. The correlation between Hurla and Peruere collecting souls is further emphasized by the giant scythe she wields, which is a strong symbol of harvest and death. As a matter of fact, Arlecchino's scythe is a perfect segue for the next part of this video. Now that we're done with her character, it's time for her animations, and I am really excited since now I get to talk about my favorite video game franchise, Dark Souls. The Knave's boss fight is primarily inspired by three characters. The first two are Sister Friede and Slave Knight Gael, whom we will talk about shortly. And the third is this woman right here, Lady Butterfly from Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which is an absolutely amazing game made by the same people behind Dark Souls and Elden Ring. Now, in the game itself, Sekiro, who is also known as the Wolf, is entrusted to Lady Butterfly by his father, the Owl, so that she may train him in the arts of the shinobi and teach him how to kill. Also, I want to quickly point out that Owl was not Sekiro's biological father. When the wolf calls him father, it's just a title, just like how Arlecchino is called father without actually being one. So in that sense, Lady Butterfly was, and I say this with heavy quotation marks, kinda like the wolf's mother figure. When it comes to the fight itself, the most obvious and glaring similarity between the two is how both women jump around on these silk threads and attack you from above. Which, by the way, when I first saw the trailer from patch 4.6, the first thing that immediately came to my mind was Lady Butterfly, due to how iconic that move is. Additionally, we know that Arlecchino's curse keeps memory fragments of the people she kills, which we can see throughout her boss fight. They even persist after her second phase, where new variations of them appear, and the key consideration here is that these are after images, which means that they are not the actual souls of the people she kills. And those of you who fought Lady Butterfly know very well that in her second phase, she summons a bunch of illusionary phantoms to attack Sekiro. But aside from their fighting styles, the similarities between Peruere and Lady Butterfly go a bit deeper than you think. Hold up, some of you are gonna really like this. Both Lady Butterfly and Peruere jump on threads of silk in mimicry of the animals they represent. It is well known that all butterflies have to produce silk during their larva stage in order to metamorphose from a caterpillar to an adult butterfly. However, Peruere represents a spider. She's got 8 appendages, just like a spider, 6 being on her back and then the 2 scythes she holds with her hands. Her animated short has her bury her pet spider, and if you choose to ignore her vision due to its placement on her back and only look at her from the front, then she ends up with 8 eyes, just like your average spider. So in that regard, unlike Lady Butterfly, Peruere's Bloodfire Silk is mimicking a spider and not a butterfly, right? Well, yes, but there's a catch. If we take a closer look at Peruere's Unleashed model, we can see that her spider-like thingies make up a certain outline, so to speak. To help us visualize this, let's grab an image of, I don't know, butterfly for example, and yeah, exactly. Thinking about Arlecchino from this perspective reminded me of a former member of the Narvinkroi's Ordo named Caterpillar. Back when patch 4.1 came out, a lot of people noticed the parallels between Caterpillar and Arlecchino, leading them to conclude that since Caterpillar took on the appearance of a hilichurl, then so too must Arlecchino be one as well. I talked about this in a really old video that I made where I explained that the similarities between the two characters are more superficial rather than literal, and why Arlecchino cannot possibly be a hilichurl because she has a vision, which is essentially an instantaneous disqualifier. Fast forward to now, and we know that this is indeed the case. Nevertheless, superficial similarities are still similarities intended by the developers, so there is still some merit to this idea. When the Traveler and Caterpillar confront the founder of the Narvinkroi's Ordo, Jacob Baker, the latter expresses his disappointment towards the fact that Caterpillar has not yet metamorphosed beyond his cocoon. Recall that Jacob once attempted to turn René into an artificial descender, despite René not possessing the inherent qualities of one. In a similar vein, although Caterpillar and Arlecchino are not the same creatures, what Peruere is represents the fulfillment of Jacob's aspirations for Caterpillar, to evolve into a true butterfly, an angel. And earlier, I talked about how Peruere can morph her appendages into giant wings with eyes akin to those on the wings of biblical angels. And since the outline of these appendages resembles the shape of a butterfly's wings, I cannot ignore the fact that many butterfly species, like the peacock butterfly you are looking at right now, have evolved eye spots on their wings. And once again, this is where the genius of Peruere's character comes into play. It's the ability of the developers to seamlessly integrate various traits and aspects into a single coherent design. Which finally brings us to Slave Knight Gael. For those of you who don't know him, well, first of all, you really should. Because Gael is the final boss of the Ringed City, and by that I don't mean the final boss of Dark Souls 3, but rather the final boss of the entire series. When it comes to Slave Knight Gael himself, he is directly based on an old children's fairy tale called Little Red Riding Hood. I am sure many of you have heard about it before, like my mom used to tell me about the story when I was a kid. It is stupidly popular. But the twist in Dark Souls is that he is the big bad wolf. By the end of the story, Gael devours the Pygmy Lords in order to harness the dark soul of humanity, so that the Painter Girl can then use his blood to draw a new world. However, the blood of the Pygmies drives him to insanity, and he ends up confronting the Ashen One in a final struggle for the future of life. Now, I know Gael's story pretty well, and as far as I can tell, there aren't any solid lore elements that carry over from him to Peruere. In that regard, he will likely have more in common with either Il Capitano or Dainsleif, or perhaps even both. The real similarities come into play with their animations. You see, while Arlecchino uses Crimson Bloodfire, Gael uses Red Soulfire, obtained from devouring the blood of the Pygmy Lords. Gael's red coat also splits into what resembles two wings, and if you take a look at the fight, the coat will sway and swing along with Gael's claymore as a follow-up on his attacks to support the blows and make them deadlier and harder to dodge. As you can probably guess at this point, a very prominent feature of the Knave's fight is her red wing, which not only burns like Gael's red coat, but also mimics the follow-up attack motion that it does. In a similar fashion, both the Knave and Slave Knight Gael share a lot in common in terms of their motifs and animations, with wide sweeping attacks, homing fire missiles, and huge jumping gap closers. And finally, we get to the third major inspiration behind the Knave's animations, Sister Friede from Ashes of Ariandel. And Friede herself is the eldest of three sisters, the other two being Yuria and Lilian, who joined a covenant with the primordial serpent Kath, becoming his maidens. Kath taught the three sisters the art of the Dark Hand, allowing them to absorb the souls of those whom they killed, which is close enough to Peruere's curse. Kath then tasked the three sisters with the objective of usurping the First Flame to end the Age of Fire established by the gods and find a Dark Lord strong enough to usher in the Dark Age of Man. Long story short, Friede, Yuria, and Lilian fail miserably, after which the eldest completely gives up, changes her name to Friede, and sequesters herself to the painted world of Ariandel, where she convinces the keeper of the realm, Father Ariandel, to give up with her and let everything rot away. Just to be clear, I am not oblivious to the similarities between what I just said and the story of the Moon Sisters in Genshin. However, this is not a theory video, so I am not interested in discussing any of that here. We can save it for a different time. Knowing that he was not strong enough at the time to take out Friede, Slave Knight Gael convinces the Ashen One to go into the painted world under the guise of meeting his master, the Painter Girl. In reality, Gael's actual plan was to stir up a conflict between the Ashen One and Sister Friede, so that the Ashen One would get rid of Friede and Ariandel on his behalf, leaving the Painter Girl alone with the Ashen One and himself. As you can imagine, this is exactly what ends up happening, which is how we end up with what the players consider to be one of the hardest boss fights in Dark Souls 3, alongside Dark Eater Midir and Slave Knight Gael himself. Now, when it comes to the animation similarities, well, Peruere has a scythe, Friede has a scythe. Peruere creates blood spikes, Friede creates ice spikes. Peruere pulls you with her scythe, Friede pulls you with her scythe. Peruere has blood fire, Father Ariandel has blood fire. Oh look, Peruere has two scythes now. Oh look, Sister Friede has two scythes now. Peruere jumps into the air and delivers a spinning bloodfire strike with her scythe. Friede, well, I think you get the point right now. The Knave's boss fight is basically a combination of the boss fights of Lady Butterfly, Slave Knight Gael, and Sister Friede. Obviously, while lacking the difficulty from all of them because Genshin Impact is a mobile game, which is something that I somehow always forget. For a few honorable mentions that likely inspire Peruere's character design but are not as involved as the aforementioned three, we have at the top of the list Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Look, I am sure many of you are going to be surprised to see me putting Lady Maria just as an honorable mention, because one would imagine that a hunter who went after the blood of the Great Ones in a nightmare controlled by a Crimson Moon would have more in common with Arlecchino. And yes, she does. But most of it is in lore. And I did say earlier that this is not a theory video, so I want to minimize speculation as much as possible. Nonetheless, I also said that the very next video will involve Herla of the Wild Hunt. And Maria, being a hunter herself, might have a lot to do with it, so keep an eye out for that one if you care. In terms of their animations, both Maria and Peruere use Bloodfire, and both are dual wielders, and that's really about it. The similarities in their attacks are not as pronounced as either Butterfly, Gael, or Friede for me to put her above any of them. When it comes to the dashing attack with her spider legs, it reminds me of Sarah Kerrigan from StarCraft. For those of you who played Heroes of the Storm, you probably know that Kerrigan has a similar attack with her wings. This laser attack she does is likely taken from Armored Core 5, which is another of FromSoftware's games. And since I brought up Armored Core, I might as well mention that Perry's English voice actor is the same as Ire from Armored Core 6. But a voice actor is not the only thing they share. Perry's Purgatorial Dance is identical to Ire's Coral Blades, and possibly even a simultaneous reference to Melania's Phantom Spirits. And the plunging strike at the start of her second phase is probably a homage to the start of Melania's second phase in Elden Ring. Her Blood-Tide Banquet from Phase 1 is literally Kafka's ultimate from Hoyoverse's other game, Honkai Star Rail, and before we enter into extreme copium territory, I will end this section by saying that her animations also have a hefty amount of overlap with Dante from the Devil May Cry series, which isn't surprising when we take into account that her Fatui name, Arlecchino, originates from Arlecchino, a devil that appears in Dante's Inferno. Alright, now that we're done with the animations, time for some mythology and anime influences behind Peruere. As you all know, Peri's constellation is Ignis Purgatorius, which means cleansing fire and symbolizes the process of purification and rebirth. But regardless of what you cleanse with fire, it always leaves behind ash, which manifests itself as the creeping black curse on Arlecchino's hands. Peri even references this when she ignites her hand during her story quest. In her 5th character story, Piero tells Peruere to read the book Perinheri to learn about her origins, and in that book, it is written that in the distant past, when the Crimson Moon still ruled Khaenri'ah, an orphanage would take in outlander children from beyond the Sea of Stars and make them crawl through a dark chimney filled with ash until they meet the gaze of a titanic, horrified eye, the Crimson Moon, after which they die and get reborn in the fire of the hearth. The Fatui named their orphanage the House of the Hearth, likely after the Khaenri'an counterpart, and Peri chose to keep that name after she took over from Korsabena. Peri herself says that she decided to keep the name because the fire of the hearth sounds warm and welcoming, which would help the children feel safe and united as a family in their home's hearth. This immediately correlates her with Hestia, who is the Greek goddess of the hearth. Hestia is the youngest of the Olympians and is renowned for being a virgin goddess who presides over home and family. You will notice that such characteristics align perfectly with Peruere. After all, she took on the title Father, where a father is traditionally the head of the household, and Peri is the head of the House of the Hearth, where she takes in the children and gives them a home and a family, despite her not being the biological mother to any of them. Finally, I would like to add that Hestia's hearth is a symbol of purification and divine sacrifice, and her fire represents kingship. And at the start of this video, we talked about how Kosabena's goal was to turn Peri into her king. Okay, we are now almost done. There is still one final eye-catching you're about to get this joke, design aspect of Peri that I noticed, and trust me, I left the best for last. Towards the end of her fight with the Traveler, Peruere does this move that you can see right here, where she flashes her eyes and pulls the Traveler into her domain, which should be some sort of realm of consciousness. Not too dissimilar from the ones that Baal, Beelzebul, and Morax can make. Now, these attacks are identical to the domain expansions that you see in Jujutsu Kaisen. But in this particular instance, as I saw Peruere opening her domain, Jujutsu Kaisen was not the first thing that came to my mind. I first remembered Madara Uchiha. You see in Naruto, I can't believe I'm talking about this. You see in Naruto, there's this clan called the Uchiha, who carry one of, if not the most iconic eyes, not just in anime, but all of fiction, period. Their eyes are so popular that I am sure all of you have seen or heard about them in some way, shape, or form before. The Sharingan. Under certain conditions, a Sharingan eye can evolve into a Mangekyou Sharingan eye, which unlocks an ability known as Tsukuyomi that allows the user to create an illusionary dreamscape where space and time are under their control. What really adds a layer of depth to all of this is that the name of the ability, Tsukuyomi, is also the name of the god of the moon in Japanese mythology. And in Genshin, we know that the Crimson Moon dynasty worshipped the Crimson Moon and forced certain children to meet its gaze so that they could bear the fire of two worlds. The main antagonist of Naruto, Madara Uchiha, sought to create a world free of suffering and war. To accomplish this, Madara subdued a world beast and transformed it into a divine tree. Madara then turned the moon into his crimson third eye. And what's crazy is that in Genshin, visions are considered a third eye, but it doesn't end here. Madara then, using the moon as his eye, cast an infinite Tsukuyomi on the entire world, binding the people to the divine tree and forcing them into his dream. An eternal paradise with neither want nor need, where Madara became the master of the dream and all the dreams of the people belonged to him. Listen, there is way more to this than the summary I just gave you right now. And the more I looked into it, the more I found until I went insane because, oh my god, this rabbit hole runs deep. But this is not the time, so I'm cutting it right here. Before we close off, there are two minor details that I would like to elaborate on. Arlecchino's normal attack invitation to a beheading, along with her infusion state, Mask of the Red Death, Both reference stories written by the authors Vladimir Nabokov and Edgar Allan Poe respectively. However, these stories don't have anything to do with her character design and are instead in theory territory, so we won't discuss them here. Secondly, and this one is very important, I am not implying whatsoever that Peruere is the Genshin equivalent of Madara Uchiha in this video. What I'm saying is that it seems like Perry's bloodline, the Crimson Moon, may be based to some degree on the Uchiha clan from Naruto. That's about it. Welp, this sure was one hell of a video to make. I originally started with 4 bullet points to discuss regarding Arlecchino's character, and those were Commedia dell'arte, Lady Butterfly, Sister Friede, and Madara. Yes, I went in with Madara in mind since the start. But the more I dug in, the more treasure I found, and I have come to realize just how much thought Hoyoverse have put into making this character. Honestly, it makes you appreciate their efforts a bit more. Anyway, this is, finally, the second video in the Design Origins series after the first one came out, how long ago? 6 months? Yeah, it's been a while. The first Design Origins video was about Paimon, and the reason for such a long delay since then is mainly due to the fact that I ended up being dissatisfied with how the video turned out. Not because the information presented in it is incorrect, but rather because I have come to change my mind on the totality of what Paimon is. And that video no longer covers everything regarding her design and source of inspiration. So I ended up getting stuck in this limbo state where I kept delaying all the other Design Origins videos that I promised while debating whether I should make a part 2 to that of Paimon to expand on the missing pieces. However, after discovering the OVA Angel's Egg and learning how all of that ties into the grand mythos of Genshin, I realized that we are still missing a lot of information about Paimon's character. So I'm going to bench Paimon for now until she comes out as a playable character, where I can make a proper assessment of her design. And we will continue with the other characters as intended. Last but not least, huge thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Patreon, and thank you for watching this video all the way until the end. Not that many people do that, so seriously, thanks. But for now, I've been My Name for now. Take care, and I'll see you in the next time.